Hi everyone. I want to say a few words about where we are in the course and what we're about to embark on, which is this book right here. I think I'll put it over here. Lorraine Code's book, Ecological Thinking. Sorry, there's a reflection there. Anyway. So let me just say a couple of words about the kind of overarching narrative for the course. And I've said this before. So the first few weeks of the course were really an attempt to get me to ground you, or help me ground you in some of the kind of basics of philosophy. And by that I don't necessarily mean only the kind of important figures or something like that, but some concepts that are really quite central and operative for thinking about knowledge, responsibility, and society. So, the kind of Western figures that we have were pretty solidly white and male, not, pretty much completely. We could have, if we'd gone with more modern figures, had more diversity. I made sure to have, figures that in some sense spoke back to that narrative, with the mostly African figures that we had as well each week. And so the purpose of that, I know most people in this class are not going to have much of a philosophy background, and so I was trying to get us on, as it were, the same page to think about just how we have encountered these concepts. And the whole thing in some sense has been a setup to get to Lorraine Code and what comes after Lorraine Code. In a certain sense, I see this book, Ecological Thinking, as the centerpiece of the course. What comes before it sets us up for it. What comes after it, in a certain sense, uses the concepts and tools that Code puts on the table for us to think through a number of other things. That is not to say that any of us, me included, are going to entirely agree with what Code says. You can totally disagree with what she says. That's not the purpose of having a centerpiece for the course. The purpose is really to think about some of the shifts right now in how we think about knowledge, responsibility, and society. And so I want to add a little bit to where we've come to this point in order to understand what Code is up to. And I'm not going to do an entire analysis of the week's readings on this. We have a presenter for that. What I want to do instead is to kind of give you a bit of background for Code, and also, think about some of the waters in which she is swimming. In other words, some of the kind of conceptual, intellectual heritage that she has, and what the questions are that she's really trying to deal with. And so, to do that, I think we have to think a little bit about the history of science, because throughout this book she's dealing quite a lot with some of the strengths and limitations of scientific method and scientific practice. Many of her examples are related to science in some way or other throughout the book. And so, we also have to understand her own background. She's Canadian. She is retired now, but was a professor for a long time at York University in Toronto, and she was at several other universities as well in various ways. She's well respected as a philosopher. She's well known for her work in epistemology and feminism particularly, but other areas as well. And so, those are the kinds of areas that she's interested in dealing with. York University has a very strong, what we think of as science and technology studies program. And, her work was certainly important in that program as well. And science and technology studies really comes out of, a kind of critique of the kind of hyper-optimism towards what science can do for us. The sort of thing that you would see really through the 50s and 60s and 70s and maybe into the 80s and so forth. You might be saying to yourself, well, that's not the world we live in today, right? I mean, if anything, there is skepticism towards science today among many people. And you'd be right about that. And so one interesting thing to think about in the context of this book is how what Code is saying relates to our situation here and now today. Okay? Whereas Code in some sense is pushing back against some of the claims of science, we might feel a little bit like we don't want to do that so much because we see what use has been made of that among some groups and some people in society. Kind of throwing science out entirely. Going with different kinds of explanations that don't have scientific grounding or basis, and really. There have been a lot of problems with this in a number of areas in society, most recently around the pandemic, right? The science of the pandemic is not trusted, the scientists are not trusted, and so forth. And so, it's worth thinking about just what code's critique is and what it might be today in these circumstances. Now, Lorraine Code is I guess you could say a friend of our department at UCF. A number of us know her, me included, and she has been down to the department, not recently, but a couple of times in the past to do papers and be part of conferences and things like that as well. So for us, she's a kind of a known quantity, a known person, and really in some ways this course initially developed out of her work. So let me just dial this back a little bit and think about science itself and the development of scientific method over the last, let's say, 200-300 years, in order to understand what Code is trying to do, and in order to understand why her critique, I think, has some force to it. So if you think about science, a lot of people might think that science has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years in the West. And for some people who don't think about it much, they might think that it comes fully formed. Scientific method is pretty much, we've had it at least ever since the waning of the Middle Ages. So we're talking 400 or 500 years by this point. And, that would be a misunderstanding of how science developed and what the social pressures on it have been. What we think of as scientific method is a relatively recent phenomenon. If we look at how science developed in Europe, we can see a number of strands. We can see strands in, let's say, in France. We have someone like René Descartes and many other, French thinkers around him who were fascinated by mathematics, fascinated by abstraction. Descartes famously is the person who says, I think, therefore I am. He starts with the mind. The mind is the important thing. The physical world is a secondary sort of thing. It follows after what we know about the mind. And to that extent, at least that extent, he would be in line with what we saw in the Middle Ages, right? You have to know the ideas of things first, and the physical reality comes after that. Now, there are many differences, it should be said. He's not just a medieval philosopher. But what it means is that for Descartes, and really through the development of French science, there's been a real emphasis on the kind of rationalistic side of it. Understanding the world means understanding the kind of, pristine structures within the world. And so mathematics has been hugely important. Deductive logic has been important, things of that nature. In England, you have a very different story, right? You have Francis Bacon, and many who follow him, John Locke, many others who really put a lot of weight on what we come to call empiricism. That is, we come to scientific knowledge through the examination of the physical world, through our senses. And so these two approaches to understanding the world, in a certain sense, can seem like they stand at odds with each other. In one case, you start with the pristine abstract structures of things. In the other case, you start with the messy observations of things. And there's more to it than that. We could look at the German tradition as well. And, in the German tradition, there is a sense that what we need to be understanding is the kind of holistic sensibility of things. Not just try to kind of take things down into their individual parts, but understanding how everything works together as an organic whole. And so what we call scientific method today is really a kind of negotiation at the edges of all of those three traditions. And we could add some more traditions to it in Europe. we could go outside of Europe, right? I mean, there are what we could think of as scientific traditions outside of the European, certainly the Chinese and the Indians would be two traditions to look to. There would be others as well. But when we think about scientific method in the West, what we're really thinking about is a development within a number of different domains of the questions that exist at the edges of those, especially those three ways of thinking about how we can reliably know the world. Okay, and so what we get through, up to the early 19th century is, quite a lot of variance in different places. I mean, there was knowledge traded back and forth. People admired people. I mean, Newton, for example, was highly admired by some in France. Emily de Châtelet, for example, who was really quite a remarkable figure in France. Around the time of Voltaire. In fact, she was a lover of Voltaire. But more importantly, she was a really great scientist and a really good philosopher, natural philosopher. And so, she wrote quite a lot about Newton. She wrote quite a lot about Leibniz in Germany. And so there was a lot of this kind of passing back and forth going on, but different traditions nonetheless. And what we come to know as science is, as I say, the negotiation at the edges of those different kinds of traditions. So by the 19th century, we start getting something that looks more unified, but it looks more unified in specific domains. And so we start getting, for example, a scientific method within biology or within physics, within astronomy, all of those sorts of things. And if you think about the differences between those domains, those areas of science, they really are quite different, right? I mean, where you could do experiments, let's say, in physics, you can't do them in astronomy in the same way, right? I mean, you can't have controlled experiments if you can't move planets around and stars around and things like that. All you can do is observe. So there's already a difference. There's a difference, again, between those sorts of sciences and what you would do in biology. And let's not even start on sociology, which comes later, or psychology, right? So as soon as we start thinking of those as sciences, again, we've got a different set of tensions and gives and takes between abstraction, physical, material observation, and the sense of what constitutes a whole. And so what we get, in a certain sense, in the 19th century, mid-19th century to, I would say, about the mid-20th century, is a kind of distillation of all of that and a sense of what really counts as real reliable knowledge and what doesn't. And so the figure to think about with something like this is Auguste Comte. Comte was a French philosopher and scientist who set up what we now know as positivism, and he called it positivism, which, among other things, was a kind of reduction of knowledge down to its simplest parts. And so he would order these various disciplines in terms of what was the most kind of reliable kind of knowledge, right? So if there is, if we have people studying, let's say, sociology and studying psychology and biology, well, how would those relate to each other, as sciences? Well, in his mind, something like sociology is, in a certain sense, the furthest away from reliable knowledge. Why is that? Because it has a lot of complicating factors. It's very difficult to isolate, things down to specific, reliable axioms. And so if you can get to biology and explain things in biological terms instead of sociological, that's a good thing. And if you can reduce biology to chemistry, that's even better. And if you can reduce chemistry to physics, that's even better, right? So you get this direction here, right? In a certain sense, some sciences turn out to be more reliable, closer to true knowledge, and some further away. And so there's this hierarchy for Comte, and that gets taken up by a lot of different people. And really up until, quite recently, actually. I mean, E.O. Wilson wrote a book called Consilience. E.O. Wilson is an extremely important, field biologist. And his argument, too, was a basically Comtean argument, which suggested that some sciences were just more about knowledge than other sciences were. So you need to understand that. You need to understand that scientific method is not one thing. It is a number of things. It is always a negotiation at the edges of different kinds of methods, and therefore it's a kind of moving sort of thing. So anyone who thinks that science is just a kind of sort of static thing and science gives us knowledge, reliable knowledge, and that's the end of the question, is really not understanding how science itself works. Now, none of this suggests that science is just a bunch of opinions or just, nothing but political or something like that. I mean, science still has its component aspects of hypothesis generation and theory formation and modeling and testing and, all sorts of stuff like that, right? It's still comprised of a lot of different things to ward off the possibility that what we think is knowledge is really not knowledge, right? We want science to be reliable in this pretty rigorous manner. So, a lot of that is being questioned today, okay? Going from questions around evolution to climate change to vaccines to, just a huge number of scientific questions. There are a significant number of people who are pretty skeptical about science. Now, is it science that they're skeptical about, or is it something else, right? I mean, for some of them, for example, they might be skeptical about the pharmaceutical industry, okay? So, yes, maybe drugs do certain kinds of things, but can we really know that? Is everything being hidden because of politics, because of, huge sums of money that can be generated, all of those sorts of things? So a lot of people end up getting quite skeptical about the product of science because they think that there are some other agendas at work. In other words, it's not what scientists think they're doing, which is just simply finding out the truth about the world and finding out the best explanations for things. And so that's the kind of pushback to science that we see a lot today. Certainly in the news, and when you hear people, questioning vaccines and all of that, that's the kind of reason that they push back. This is not why Code is pushing back. Okay, Code is pushing back against science, but she is not anti-science. Okay, she is very interested not so much in undermining the political agendas in science, although she's well aware that can happen. What she's more interested in is the way that science ends up often having a kind of reductionist sort of tendency within its methods. And that's what she, really much of this book is about. And if you look in the first chapter, called Ecological Thinking, Subversions and Transformations, she gives us some of her starting points. And one of those starting points is Deleuze, Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari. And Deleuze and Guattari are interested in, I guess the best way to put it is networks. The idea that a lot of what happens in the world happens because things are involved in sets of relations. Those relations are not necessarily predictable relations. They may create brand new things in ways that we can't anticipate. And so what we're always facing in the world is what we might think of as complex space, okay? And so Code is starting from recognizing that the world is not as reductionist as Auguste Comte and others would have liked it to be, right? We can't necessarily reduce everything to chemistry and physics and mathematics and whatever it is that, we think is the most reliable form of knowledge. The fact is we are faced with a universe which resists that, okay? And so she talks a little bit about, about Deleuze and Pierre Bourdieu and Cornelius Castoriadis and, a number of other figures, many of whom are kind of taking us down a similar path. And then she gets to a couple of her main examples. One of them is Rachel Carson, and one of them is Karen Messing. And so with Rachel Carson, the question is, if you know anything about Rachel Carson, she is famous for having published a book called Silent Spring. She was a field biologist, and she was making the first kinds of connections between the kinds of chemicals that we would use on crops and the effect that it had on wildlife, particularly birds. Okay, so the Silent Spring in the title of the book is really about the time when these chemicals would render birds' eggs too fragile, and therefore birds would not be born, and therefore it would be silent. In other words, no bird song, no bird singing anymore. Okay, so this is the kind of future she fears. And so she's the one who really got DDT banned, right? And, you know, there can be arguments actually about whether it should have been banned, whether it has uses outside of being applied, you know, liberally to, you know, fields and things like that. The point is that Code is going after is that Rachel Carson makes us change our way of thinking about how reality works, because she does not start with that reductionist sort of story that I told you that Comte gives us. You know, real knowledge is this knowledge of, you know, abstract things if possible. She starts with the idea that the world is a set of networks. That is, after all, what biological reality is. It's always a set of networks. That's why Code calls this ecological thinking, right? She too wants to start with the idea that we are dealing with sets of networks of things that have uncertain and unpredictable results and outcomes, but also are not totally random, right? In other words, we can know things about nature. We just have to learn how to listen to it, right? We just have to learn that those networks, you know, the beings who are parts of those networks learn to read those networks very well in ways that we are not very good at, right? Our tendency has been to try and dominate nature, to try and make it do what we want it to do, right? That's been the story we've told about to ourselves, and it's been the story, unfortunately, that people have interpreted out of religious writings, like, you know, for Christians. That, by the way, I believe is a misreading of Christianity, but nonetheless, it is a long-standing reading of Christianity, which says, the earth is yours, dominate and control it, okay? And so that's been the way that people have thought about how they deal with the earth, instead of being stewards of the earth, which is, I think, closer to what the message actually is. But that notion of domination and control of the earth goes hand in hand with that certain kind of scientific method, which says what you need to do is understand things at arm's length as objective facts about the world, and once you understand them, then you can control them, okay? What Carson and Code are asking us to do is to give up that desire of control in order to truly have knowledge, to truly have understanding, okay? Messing as well, Karen Messing, is interested in the question of testimony, and she's interested in, you know, her research was on workplace illness, especially among women, and she kept getting dismissed. You know, like the data she was collecting, or the, you know, it was all soft data as far as, you know, anyone else was concerned. You know, you don't really know that women are, you know, getting sick at a higher rate, you know, in workplace settings than men are, or than they should be, or whatever. Well, from our vantage point, we know very well that yes, absolutely, that does happen, right? And why are we willing to admit that now, whereas at a time in the past we were not willing to admit it? Well, in part it's because of a change of understanding of how not just cause and effect works, but also, you know, how we live in a complex world, right? So it's very, very difficult to pin down, you know, when somebody gets sick, you know, here is the cause. You, at this moment, you breathed in this bit of something, or you were in this place, and that directly caused this tumor or this effect or this whatever. Extremely difficult to do that, and also unnecessary to do that, right? You know, if you have an idea of knowledge that requires that, then, you know, you're never going to be able to account for the fact that in some places more people get sick than in other places. In some places, women get sick when men don't, right? In some places, these phenomena happen. So, you know, in effect, you know, if you have that notion of knowledge which says you have to have this hard and fast causal connection, you know, you might as well just give up saying that we can't even have any knowledge about a lot of complex things in which, you know, we have to remain embedded within a world. And so, Code uses Messing as another example of somebody who is arguing for something more like a knowledge that exists within within our lives, within a structure in which we live, not simply at arm's length. That we can simply know something in an objective sense and a kind of universal sense. So, I'm not going to talk much further on this. I just want to kind of give you a basis for understanding what Lorraine Code is up to. I mean, I think she is making a case that we've already seen a little bit of in ways that some of you have pushed back against some of the readings that I've given you, and I think rightly so. I mean, Code 2 is pushing back against, a kind of liberal view of society, or, a notion that we can separate off our, our commonality as humans from how we know the world, so separate off our ethics and our epistemology. Separate off our social institutions from all of these things. Code's commitment is going to be that we have to know about all of these things together at the same time, not as separate entities. And so that's why I think she's such a great person for a course like this. If we're going to think about ethics in the context of what we can know, what we should know, what we ought to know, and the social institutions and organizations that we have, if that's what ethics means, rather than an abstract sort of thing that we think up principles, or think up how you would act in difficult situations, if that's what we're going to think about, they've got something a lot more interesting, and I think Code is going to give us some idea of what to do with that. So that's a quick introduction to Lorraine Code, and I hope you enjoy this read. I think it's well worth it, and one thing I hope we do is to use the opportunity when we look at Code to kind of go back and look at some of the earlier readings that we have seen. Some of those might have just directly led us up to someone like Code. So Sylvia Wynter, for example, we might very strongly see what Wynter is talking about, or maybe a Magobe Ramosa. Ramosa's idea of Ubuntu might come close to this. On the other hand, Augustine, Aristotle, maybe not. How about Foucault? Does Foucault get us here? So let's start kind of drawing some lines, if we can, between some of the people we've seen and where we're going. And then after this, of course, in the syllabus, we're looking at some, biomedical cases for a bit, and we're going to do a bunch of other things. And I think all of that flows out of this way of thinking about ethics that Code really tries to nail down for us. So that is what we got, and looking forward to the discussion. See you soon.